Before the story begins, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more emotional and surprising stories ahead. And now let's dive into today's story. Who gets the lake house when mom is gone? My son asked while I was still sitting at the head of the table, holding a fork in my hand. For a moment I thought I had misheard him. The dining room was filled with the warm glow of birthday candles and the smell of roasted chicken, fresh rolls, and the apple pie I had baked that morning. It was my 72nd birthday. My family was gathered around the table. My children, my grandchildren, the people I had spent my entire life loving. Yet suddenly, the room felt colder than a January morning in Minnesota. I sat very still and looked at Daniel. My son didn't seem embarrassed. He didn't even seem aware of how his question sounded. Across the table, my daughter Rebecca lowered her wine glass and said, "I think the lake house should be sold. Splitting the money would be much easier." Olivia, my daughter-in-law, nodded thoughtfully as if they were discussing a routine business matter. "Real estate taxes alone are getting expensive these days," she added. I glanced around the table waiting for someone to laugh, to point out how ridiculous this conversation was. Nobody did. My grandson kept scrolling through his phone. Rebecca reached for another dinner roll. Daniel took a sip of wine. Life continued as if I had already disappeared. Earlier that afternoon, I had stood in my kitchen carefully arranging flowers in a crystal vase. I had pressed my best tablecloth, polished the silverware, and set out the china my late husband William and I bought on our 25th wedding anniversary. I wanted the evening to feel special. Not because 72 was a milestone birthday. It wasn't. I simply wanted one peaceful evening surrounded by family. Looking at them now, I realized we were not sharing the same celebration. I was celebrating another year of life. They were discussing what would happen after it ended. "The investment account should probably be divided equally," Rebecca said. "That would only be fair." Daniel shook his head. "The lake house is worth much more than the accounts." Olivia pulled out her phone and started typing notes. Actual notes. My estate had somehow become the evening's main topic. I lowered my fork onto the plate. The small metallic sound seemed louder than it should have. Nobody stopped talking. Nobody looked at me. I thought about the years William and I spent building everything they were now casually dividing. The overtime shifts. The missed vacations. The sacrifices nobody remembered anymore. Every dollar represented years of work. Every property carried memories. To me, they were pieces of a life. To my children, they seemed to be numbers on a spreadsheet. Then Rebecca leaned back in her chair and smiled. "We should probably settle these things now before everything gets complicated later." The room fell quiet for a second. I looked directly at my daughter. She smiled politely, waiting for agreement. In that moment, I understood something I had been refusing to see for a very long time. And before the evening was over, I would hear something that changed everything. Nobody spoke for a few seconds after Rebecca made that comment. The silence should have felt uncomfortable. Instead, it felt strangely normal to everyone except me. Daniel leaned forward and rested his elbows on the table. "I am just saying that planning ahead prevents problems later," he said. Rebecca nodded immediately. Olivia continued looking at her phone. It was almost impressive how naturally they discussed my future without including me in the conversation. I picked up my water glass and took a small sip. The ice had nearly melted. Around me, forks scraped against plates and glasses clinked softly. It looked like an ordinary family dinner. If someone had walked in from outside, they would have seen smiles and polite conversation. They would never have guessed that my children were calmly dividing up pieces of my life. "The jewelry should probably stay in the family," Olivia said. "Especially Grandma's pieces." Grandma. That was me. I was sitting less than 10 feet away. "The sapphire necklace alone must be worth a fortune," Rebecca added. I remembered the necklace immediately. William had given it to me on our 40th wedding anniversary. He had spent months secretly saving for it. We had celebrated with dinner at a small restaurant overlooking the water. I could still remember the way he smiled when he opened the box. Now it was being discussed like an item at an auction. I looked toward the framed family photographs on the far wall. There was one from a summer vacation 20 years earlier. Daniel was teaching his younger sister how to fish. Another showed Rebecca graduating from college. William stood proudly beside her with his arm around her shoulders. We had been a family once. At least I thought we had been. The conversation continued. Investment accounts, insurance policies, property values, taxes. Every subject seemed to lead back to the same question. What would happen when I was gone? Not one person asked what I wanted to do with my own future. Not one person asked if I planned to sell anything, donate anything, or leave things exactly as they were. Their assumptions seemed to have already become facts in their minds. Then Emily, my granddaughter, quietly looked up from her plate. She was 22 and usually avoided family disagreements. "Grandma is right here," she said softly. The room became still. For the first time all evening, everyone looked at me. Daniel gave an awkward laugh. Rebecca shifted in her chair. Olivia quickly locked her phone screen. "Of course she is," Daniel said. "We are only talking." But something had changed. They knew I had heard every word. They knew I understood exactly what they were discussing. I smiled politely and reached for another piece of bread. Nobody mentioned the estate again for the rest of the evening. Instead, they talked about weather, travel plans, and work schedules. The conversation sounded normal again. Yet beneath every word, I felt something I could not ignore. Later that night, after the last car pulled out of my driveway and the house finally became quiet, I stood alone in the kitchen looking at the dishes stacked beside the sink. That was when I remembered something Thomas Green had told William years ago. A sentence I had not thought about in a very long time. And suddenly I realized there might be far more happening behind my back than I had ever imagined. After I finished cleaning the kitchen, I poured myself a cup of tea and sat alone at the same table where my family had been gathered only an hour earlier. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. William had bought that clock at an estate sale almost 30 years ago. He used to joke that it would outlive both of us. That night, the sound seemed louder than usual. I kept thinking about the sentence that had suddenly returned to my memory. Years ago, shortly after we completed our estate planning, Thomas Green had visited our home. William and I sat with him in this very dining room while he reviewed documents and explained legal details. Before leaving, Thomas had looked directly at William and said, "The people who ask about your estate before they ask about your well-being are usually telling you more than they realize." At the time we had laughed. Our children were young adults building careers and raising families. Neither of us imagined those words would ever matter. Yet now they echoed in my mind with uncomfortable clarity. The next morning I woke before sunrise. A pale orange light stretched across the backyard. I made coffee and stood by the kitchen window watching a pair of robins search for worms near the garden William loved. For years mornings had brought me peace. That morning brought questions. Had I missed warning signs? Had there been moments when my children revealed who they were, and I simply chose not to see it? As I thought about it, small memories began surfacing. Daniel asking detailed questions about property taxes that did not concern him. Rebecca casually bringing up inheritance stories she had heard from friends. Olivia always seeming unusually interested whenever financial matters came up during family gatherings. None of those moments had felt important on their own. Together they formed a pattern. Around 10 o'clock, I opened a hallway closet looking for old photo albums. Instead, I found a cardboard box filled with documents William had organized years earlier. Tax records, property deeds, insurance statements. Beneath them sat a leather folder containing copies of our original estate plans. I carried everything to the dining room table and began reading. Hours passed. Sunlight moved slowly across the room. The more I reviewed, the more I realized how carefully William had prepared for our future. He had documented everything. Every account. Every property. Every instruction. He believed clarity prevented conflict. By late afternoon, I closed the folder and leaned back in my chair. A strange feeling settled over me. Not fear. Not anger. Awareness. For the first time, I stopped viewing the conversation at my birthday dinner as a careless mistake. It felt deliberate, thoughtful, practiced. Then my phone vibrated on the table. A text message from Rebecca appeared on the screen. It seemed innocent enough at first glance. But after reading it twice, I realized it contained a question she had no reason to ask. And suddenly, I knew I needed to speak with Thomas Green as soon as possible. The message from Rebecca was only 2 sentences long. "By the way, Have you updated any of your documents recently? Just curious. Beneath it sat a smiling emoji that somehow made the question feel even less sincere. I stared at the screen for several seconds before setting the phone down. Rebecca had never shown interest in legal paperwork before. In fact, she usually avoided conversations involving finances unless they directly affected her. Yet now she wanted to know whether I had updated my documents. Not how I was feeling. Not whether I enjoyed my birthday. Not whether I needed help around the house. The question stayed with me throughout the evening. The next morning, I called Thomas Green's office. His assistant informed me that he had an opening that afternoon. By 3 o'clock, I was sitting across from him in the same office William and I had visited for years. The room looked exactly as I remembered. Dark wood shelves lined the walls. Family photographs sat on a cabinet behind his desk. Thomas himself looked older, of course. So did I. But his sharp blue eyes missed very little. He listened quietly while I described the birthday dinner. I repeated every detail I could remember. The questions. The comments. The way Olivia had been taking notes on her phone. When I finished, Thomas folded his hands together and sat silently for a moment. "Margaret," he finally said, "I need to ask you something important. Has anyone in your family contacted my office recently?" A strange feeling settled in my stomach. "Why would they do that?" I asked. Thomas opened a folder and glanced at several pages. "Because over the past 18 months, I have received multiple inquiries regarding your estate." The room suddenly felt smaller. "From who?" I asked. Thomas adjusted his glasses. "Your son contacted us twice asking general questions about inheritance procedures. Your daughter called once regarding property transfers. Nothing illegal. Nothing inappropriate on its own. But together the pattern caught my attention." I looked out the window behind him. Cars moved through the afternoon traffic. People walked along the sidewalk carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Ordinary life continued outside while my understanding of my own family quietly shifted. "Why did nobody tell me?" I asked. Thomas gave a sympathetic smile. "Because technically they were only asking questions. We could not discuss your private matters." But I remember thinking it was unusual. I lowered my eyes to the folder on his desk. For years I had assumed my children were focused on their own lives. Their careers. Their marriages. Their children. Now I realized they had been paying attention to something else as well. Something they thought I would never notice. Then Thomas opened another file and slid a single document across the desk toward me. "There is one more thing you should probably see," he said. The moment I read the first line, I understood why he had looked concerned. The document was not a legal filing or a request for information. It was a handwritten summary prepared by Thomas after one of the phone calls. He slid the paper toward me and allowed me to read it in silence. According to his notes, Daniel had asked several detailed questions about what would happen if I decided to move into assisted living. He had also asked how quickly property could be transferred after an estate was settled. None of those questions were improper by themselves. Yet seeing them written together created a different impression. I looked up from the page. "He never mentioned any of this to me," I said quietly. Thomas nodded. "That is what concerned me." He opened another folder. This one contained a record of Rebecca's inquiry. She had asked whether jointly inherited property could be sold if one beneficiary wanted to keep it, and another wanted to liquidate it. Again, nothing illegal. Nothing unusual in isolation. But together the questions painted a picture that I could no longer ignore. My children had been thinking about my assets long before that birthday dinner. The conversation at the table had not appeared out of nowhere. It had simply revealed what had already been on their minds. I sat back in my chair and stared at the shelves lining Thomas's office. For years I had told myself that my family was close. We celebrated holidays together. We exchanged gifts. We gathered for birthdays and graduations. Yet now I found myself wondering how much of that closeness was real and how much was habit. Thomas remained quiet, giving me time to think. Finally he said, "Margaret, I am not telling you that your children are bad people. I am only suggesting that you pay attention to actions instead of assumptions." His words stayed with me. Actions instead of assumptions. On the drive home I replayed dozens of memories in my mind. Small comments. casual questions, conversations that seemed harmless at the time. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had made a decision. I was not going to confront anyone. Not yet. People reveal far more when they believe nobody is watching. Over the next several days, I paid closer attention. Daniel suddenly called twice in 1 week. Rebecca checked in more often than usual. Olivia sent friendly messages asking whether I needed help with anything around the house. Under different circumstances, I might have appreciated the attention. Instead, I found myself listening carefully to every word. Then an opportunity presented itself unexpectedly. During a Sunday family call, I casually mentioned that I had been reviewing my finances and considering some major changes. The reaction was immediate. The conversation became noticeably more focused. Questions arrived faster. Suggestions appeared from every direction. I answered politely and revealed very little. By the end of the call, I had learned something important. They were far more interested in what I planned to do with my assets than in why I was making those decisions. And later that evening, an unexpected message from Emily arrived that made me realize the situation was even deeper than I had feared. Emily's message arrived just before 9 o'clock that evening. Unlike the others, she rarely contacted me without a specific reason. The message was short. "Grandma, I think there is something you should know. Can we talk tomorrow?" I stared at the screen for several moments. Emily was thoughtful and careful with her words. If she believed something was important, it usually was. The next afternoon, we met at a small coffee shop a few miles from my neighborhood. It was a quiet place with large windows overlooking a tree-lined street. Emily arrived carrying a backpack and looking more nervous than I had ever seen her. After we ordered our drinks, she sat across from me and wrapped both hands around her cup. For a few moments she said nothing. Then she took a deep breath. "Grandma, I do not want to cause problems in the family," she said. "But I think you deserve to know what people have been saying." I remained silent and let her continue. Emily explained that several weeks before my birthday dinner, she had attended a family gathering at Daniel's house. During the evening, conversations eventually turned toward finances. First, she paid little attention. Then she began hearing comments that made her uncomfortable. Daniel talked about the lake house. Rebecca discussed property values. Olivia wondered aloud whether maintaining multiple properties was practical. None of them knew Emily was listening from the next room. "At first I thought they were just talking," Emily said. "But then it started sounding like they were making plans." I felt a familiar heaviness settle in my chest. Not because the information surprised me anymore. Because it confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. Emily reached into her backpack and pulled out her phone. "There is something else," she said quietly. She opened a message thread and turned the screen toward me. I read carefully. The messages were not cruel. They were not openly hostile. In many ways they were worse. They discussed timelines, possibilities, potential outcomes. There were references to future property decisions and assumptions about assets eventually becoming available. Reading the words felt strangely surreal. It was like watching people discuss a future version of my life that excluded me entirely. I handed the phone back and took a sip of coffee. The drink had grown cold. "Thank you for telling me," I said. Emily looked relieved. "I was worried you would be upset." I smiled gently. "I am grateful that you were honest." On the drive home, I thought about everything I had learned during the past few weeks. A pattern had emerged so clearly that I could no longer dismiss it. Yet instead of anger, I felt something else. Clarity. For the first time, I understood exactly what I needed to do. That evening, I called Thomas Green and scheduled another appointment. This time, I was not looking for answers. I was ready to make decisions. And when Thomas asked what I wanted to change, I told him I had an idea that would reveal everyone's true intentions faster than any question ever could. When I arrived at Thomas Green's office the following week, I felt calmer than I had in months. The uncertainty was gone. I no longer needed to wonder what was happening. I needed to see how far it would go. Thomas listened carefully as I explained my idea. After I finished, he leaned back in his chair and smiled slightly. "It will certainly provide clarity," he said. That was exactly what I wanted. Over the next several days, I began putting the plan into motion. During individual conversations with Daniel, Rebecca, and Olivia, I casually mentioned that I had been reviewing my finances and considering a major change. I explained that maintaining multiple properties was becoming more responsibility than I wanted at this stage of my life. Then I added one additional detail. I told them I was thinking about selling several assets and donating a substantial portion of the proceeds to charitable organizations that William and I had supported for years. The reaction was immediate. Daniel became unusually serious. He asked whether I had spoken with financial advisors. Rebecca wanted to know exactly which properties I was considering. Olivia asked whether I had calculated the tax implications. Not one of them asked why I wanted to make the change. Not one asked whether the decision would make me happier. Their focus remained fixed on the assets themselves. A few days later, I invited everyone to Sunday dinner. Nothing formal. Just family. At least that was what they believed. As we gathered around the table, I mentioned the idea again. This time I provided slightly more detail. I explained that I was considering selling the lake house and creating a charitable fund in William's memory. The effect was impossible to miss. Daniel nearly dropped his fork. Rebecca stared at me as if she had misheard. Olivia exchanged a quick glance with Daniel before forcing a smile. "That seems like a very big decision," Rebecca said carefully. "Maybe you should wait a little longer before doing something permanent." Daniel nodded. "You do not want to rush into anything." I found those comments interesting because none of them had expressed similar caution when discussing how to divide my property. Throughout dinner, the conversation repeatedly returned to the same subject. Every road somehow led back to the lake house, the investments, or the estate. I answered politely but revealed very little. The less information I provided, the more interested they became. By the end of the evening, I was certain the test was working. Then something unexpected happened. As guests prepared to leave, Olivia stepped onto the back porch to take a phone call. She did not realize the kitchen window was partially open. I was carrying dishes toward the sink when I heard part of the conversation. Her voice was low, but one sentence reached me clearly. "If she really donates that money, everything changes." I froze for a moment, holding a dinner plate in my hands. Then I heard footsteps approaching and the conversation ended. That single sentence told me more than hours of explanations ever could. And the next morning, Thomas called with news that would change the entire situation. Thomas sounded unusually serious when I answered the phone the next morning. "Margaret, I think you should come by the office," he said. "There is something we need to discuss in person." An hour later, I was sitting across from him again. He placed a folder on his desk and slid it toward me. "Since our last meeting, I reviewed a few things more carefully," he said. "Nothing improper has occurred, but there are developments you should know about." Inside the folder were notes documenting additional inquiries made over the past year. Some had come through assistants. Others had been phrased as hypothetical questions. Yet they all revolved around the same topic: property transfers, estate procedures, asset distribution. Reading through the pages felt less like discovering new information and more like watching pieces of a puzzle finally lock into place. Thomas looked at me quietly. "You have every right to structure your plans however you choose," he said. "The important thing is that those decisions reflect your wishes, not someone else's expectations." I nodded slowly. For the first time in weeks, I felt completely certain. The confusion was gone. So was the guilt. I was no longer reacting emotionally. I was simply observing facts. During the following week, I met with financial advisors, reviewed documents, and organized records that had not been updated in years. The process brought back memories of William. He had always believed that preparation created peace of mind. As I worked through each file, I could almost hear his voice reminding me to focus on what mattered most. One evening, while sorting through old papers, I found a letter he had written shortly before his retirement. It was not a legal document. It was simply a reflection on family, responsibility, and gratitude. I sat in the living room reading it long after sunset. What struck me most was not what he wrote about money. It was what he wrote about character. He believed that people revealed their priorities through consistent behavior, not occasional words. The next few days provided even more confirmation. Daniel called asking whether I had reached any decisions about the lake house. Rebecca wanted to know if I had spoken with real estate agents. Olivia asked whether I had selected any charities yet. Their questions arrived from different directions, but they all circled the same subject. Meanwhile, Emily checked on me simply to ask how I was doing. The contrast was impossible to ignore. By the end of the month, I had finalized a plan that reflected everything William and I valued. It was thoughtful, fair, intentional. Most importantly, it was entirely my decision. Then I invited the family to another gathering at my house. The invitation was simple and offered no explanation. Unsurprisingly, everyone accepted almost immediately. On the evening of the gathering, cars filled the driveway just as they had on my birthday. Familiar faces entered the house. Conversations filled the rooms. Smiles appeared. Yet this time I noticed details I would have missed before. Curious glances. Quiet questions. Unspoken expectations. As everyone settled into the living room, a knock sounded at the front door. I opened it and welcomed Thomas inside. The moment my children saw him standing there with a leather portfolio in his hand, the entire atmosphere in the room changed. The room became noticeably quieter as Thomas stepped inside. Nobody said anything at first. Daniel glanced toward Rebecca. Rebecca looked at Olivia. I simply smiled and invited everyone to sit down. Once the conversations faded, Thomas took a seat beside me and placed his portfolio on the coffee table. The atmosphere felt very different from my birthday dinner. Back then, I had been the only person listening carefully. Now everyone seemed to be paying attention. I stood and looked around the room. Faces I had loved my entire life looked back at me. My children. My family. For a moment I remembered school plays, family vacations, scraped knees, graduations, and holiday mornings. Then I remembered the conversations about property, inheritance, and future assets that had taken place while I was still very much alive. I asked all of you here because I wanted to share a decision, I said. Nobody interrupted. Over the past several months, I have spent a great deal of time reviewing my plans, my finances, and the legacy your father and I hope to leave behind. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair. Rebecca folded her hands together. Thomas remained silent. What I realized, I continued, is that a legacy is not measured by the value of a house, an account, or a piece of jewelry. It is measured by the values those things represent. The room stayed still. Then Thomas opened his portfolio and handed me several documents. I did not read every detail aloud. There was no need. Instead, I explained the decisions I had made. A charitable fund honoring William's memory would be established. Several causes we had supported for years would receive meaningful contributions. Certain family heirlooms would be given to individuals who genuinely cherished their history rather than their market value. Other assets would remain structured in ways that reflected responsibility, gratitude, and long-term stewardship. Nobody argued. Nobody raised their voice. Yet I could see surprise on several faces. Some expectations had clearly changed. After I finished, I sat down and looked directly at my children. I want you to understand something, I said softly. This was never about money. Nobody spoke. The moment that changed everything happened months ago. I was sitting at a table surrounded by people I loved, listening as my future was discussed as though I were no longer part of it. That experience taught me something important. Daniel lowered his eyes. Rebecca looked away. I spent years believing that what I owned would someday be my legacy. I was wrong. Character is a legacy. Integrity is a legacy. The way we treat people while they are here matters far more than anything they leave behind. The silence that followed felt different from the uncomfortable silences of the past. This one carried understanding. As the evening continued, conversations gradually returned. Some were awkward. Some were sincere. But for the first time in a long while, everything felt honest. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, I stood on the back porch looking across the dark yard. The air was cool and peaceful. I thought about William and the life we had built together. Then I smiled. They had spent months focused on what I might leave behind. In the end, the most valuable thing I gave them was a lesson they would never forget. And that's the end of today's story. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more unforgettable stories like this. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.